I'm here with Maegan Parker Brooks, and we're going to talk about both of her books with University Press of Mississippi, The Speeches of Fannie Lou Hamer, To Tell It Like It Is, and the, would you call it a rhetorical biography?
Exactly.
I would.
Yes.
A voice that could stir an army, Fannie Lou Hamer, and the rhetoric of the Black freedom movement. First, thanks for coming to Jackson, all the way from Salem, Oregon.
Thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
And you're doing a lot. Last night you were at University of Southern Mississippi. What was happening there?
Oh, it was wonderful. It was the release of a tribute that our documentary team, Fannie Lou Hamer's America, made for Mrs. Hamer. And I was speaking essentially about these works and my journey to studying Mrs. Hamer and now working on the documentary and the curriculum. So they were gracious enough to host me for a sort of keynote presentation, and it was amazing. We ended up having a standing room only crowd, and it's just a beautiful testament to Mrs. Hamer and how interested people still are in learning about her.
Oh, fantastic. And then from here, you're going to go to Ruleville, Mississippi Friday, and they are observing, is it the 50th anniversary of her death or her birth?
Well, it's the 100th anniversary of her birth. So
Okay.
yeah, she would have been 100 tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, on October 6th. So Ruleville does this wonderful celebration annually. Every year since her death, they celebrate her birthday, and it's a beautiful celebration with civil rights anthem movement singing and speeches. We're going to show clips from our documentary. Mississippi Public Broadcasting, I think, will be showing their documentary as well. So it's a fantastic event in celebration of Mrs. Hamer's life.
Oh, good. I'm so glad you could be here for that. Now, Ruleville was that where she was born or near where she was born?
Yeah, so she was born in Montgomery County in Tunmalin, Mississippi, but she was raised primarily in Ruleville, and they moved when they were about 2 years old out to the Marlowe plantation where her parents and ultimately her worked as a sharecropper. And then she stayed there for the remainder of her life. I mean, even as she spoke nationally, traveled to the west coast of Africa, she always came back to Ruleville, and that's where she raised her children and ultimately died.
Okay, and I remember reading in the biography, your biography, that she had asked an executor not to bury her on a plantation, and he found that to be probably the greatest challenge ever given to an executor because Montgomery County was really all that, plantation everywhere, and he finally found one great place to have her be laid to rest, and that is a freedom farm of just 40 acres, is that right?
So Freedom Farm at its height was about 160 acres,
Okay.
But they lost some of that land over the years to creditors and different things. But Fannie Lou Hamer, bought the first 40 acres outright with money that she raised from her speaking tours and her different fundraisers across the nation. So that is very fittingly where she's buried. There's now a beautiful gazebo that the Ruleville community has donated, and it has names of local civil rights activists. We brought a 8-foot bronze statue there in 2012, so this is the 5th anniversary of that statue dedication, and so that statue's there, and the community is also working on a remarkable museum right there on that same property, so it's a really special place to pay tribute to Mrs. Hamer.
And that's where you will be tomorrow.
Yeah, and that's where we'll be speaking. I'll be speaking in the garden in the morning, but the celebration goes from 10 to 3. It's an all-day thing, so there'll be events going on all day there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the power of Fannie Lou Hamer and really what's in these two books. This is a collection of her speeches, which I was astonished when we first marketed it that really such a thing had not been done.
No.
Astonished because really speaking was one of the vehicles that made this she was not great in stature. She was not great in political power before she started. She was certainly not great in riches, but that voice and her ability made her something extraordinary in our history. What gave her the that kind of power when she spoke,
Mm-hmm.
that power to wake people up,
Mm-hmm.
to make them recognize suffering. You talk about the prophet Jeremiah a little bit, and I was very
Mm-hmm.
interested in what you said.
Yeah, absolutely. She didn't have a formal education. She different accounts say that she went to school through midway through grade school, where she had to drop out and help the family sharecrop. And so when we study different rhetors, we typically think about their formal training, right? And part of
Yes.
what I'm doing in these books, and Davis and I are doing in this book, is trying to think about how her community in which she was reared gave her an informal training in speaking. And so one of the traditions that she was really drawing upon in her speeches is the Black Baptist tradition.
Okay.
And within that tradition, the Afro-American Jeremiad, it's called, is a very powerful form of influence. And essentially, that Jeremiadic tradition reasons that America is this sort of chosen land, and African Americans are chosen people within a chosen land.
Okay.
And the key to the liberation and the redeeming of this United States is the liberation of African Americans. And so she would argue, and many people who heard her really believed this, that she was a prophet, and she was sent from God, she would say, to preach release to the captives, right? So part of her mission was absolutely communicating to white and northern audiences about what Black people were facing in Mississippi, so that they would help intervene. But part of it was also encouraging African Americans to rise up and to demand their voting rights, and to demand fair treatment, and to demand living wages, right? That was part of her message too, and she imbued that with sort of divine significance to really encourage local audiences here in Mississippi. She would use the Jeremiad a lot more when she was speaking here. She used a lot more religious allusion when she was speaking here in the South than what we found when she was speaking to different northern audiences.
Okay.
Yeah.
And also she was very very great at doing something else that Jeremiah did, which was to talk about suffering. And you say in the biography several times that she took that awful experience at the Winona jail and could bring it to life within a talk in such a way that that suffering and endangerment and embattlement became obvious. What happened in Winona, and how did she use that afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, the story of Fannie Lou Hamer's time in Winona jail was her signature piece, along with the Jeremiad, and she would combine these two forms frequently in speech. If King was known for his sort of dream, Hamer was known for her Winona nightmare. And she talked about the experience of returning in 1963 from a voting registration workshop, being arrested along with a group of protesters, being imprisoned, hearing the sounds of fellow protesters being beaten, and then being dragged into a cell herself, being beaten forcibly by two Black prisoners, being sexually abused by a white police officer. And the way that she told this story before the nation at the Democratic National Convention in 1964, but then, in more intimate settings throughout her life, she used this technique we call in rhetorical studies ekphrasis. And it's the idea of taking from the ancient Greek, where you bring a visual image to mind through words. And through that verbal connection an evocation, really, of a visual image, your audience kind of almost transports themselves there as they hear it. And so when you hear her deliver this testimony, she knew that tradition of offering testimony from her church, right? But she imbued it with every human sense, right? She talked about what it looked like. She talked about what it felt, how her body felt after the beating. She talked about what it smelled like in their corn whiskey that the prisoners were made to drink, right? You got a sense, you got all of the senses, and you could transport yourself there and imagine the suffering that she endured. And then that suffering becomes, through her rhetorical turn, somewhat redemptive. She's using it not so that it happened in vain, right, but as a means to show the nation what Blacks were suffering for trying to just learn about their voting registration rights, not even
let alone
let alone register to vote, right?
Yeah.
And so that became a powerful signature.
And it seems she was able to use that again in really, really key moments. In some ways, she was also saying, I am alive, I am still fighting,
Yeah.
this is what this is going to take. I wanted to ask you too about her arc of learning in speaking. One of the things that I found fascinating in your biography was that you brought out that she came from that ability to use the Baptist rhetoric and to use the imagery and speak plainly, but when it came to using statistics and to delivering real hard-hitting things, she could do that too, and did so when she testified about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. In fact, so powerfully so, I heard on the radio this morning that Lyndon Johnson, in the middle of her televised testimony, said, we're going to have to call a press conference because we've got to stop this.
Yeah.
What was happening with that speech, and what did it show about her remarkable abilities?
Yeah, absolutely. So both in the famous 1964 Democratic National Convention speech, and then also a year later in a 1965 testimony she gives before Congress, when she and Annie Devine of Canton, Mississippi, and Victoria Gray Adams of Hattiesburg did this brilliant congressional protest where they demanded the seats of the congresspeople sent from the state of Mississippi, saying that they were legally elected because blacks weren't allowed to vote.
Right.
So she delivers this powerful testimony before a congressional subcommittee in which she garners very specific evidence to demonstrate her case. And that was a rare speech for her, but because it was scripted, right? She spoke really brilliantly, extemporaneously, but it showed her range as a rhetor, right? And it really confirmed this sense that I heard from all the people who listened to her, that she was thoughtful and strategic about her speaking, that she was careful, and she would, edit her talks both orally and then after the fact. She was constantly thinking about how she could best be used, right, in that prophetic sense, to spread the word. And so, yeah, I love that congressional testimony, that 1965 one as well. It's not as famous as the 1964 Democratic National Convention testimony, but it remarkably shows how she could sort of assume this persona of a congresswoman. That's what she was trying to demonstrate, right? That she was the rightful person who should be sitting on the floor of the House. And she, Victoria Gray Adams and Annie Devine were the first 3 African American women to ever be seated on the floor of Congress while they waited for that. So just powerful. And that was 1965, right? That not too distant history.
Right, very recent history. Oh my gracious. Well, we've been talking with Maegan Parker Brooks, and she is here in Mississippi to talk about her 2 books, and also to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer. This has just been really great. Thanks for sitting down with me.
Absolutely, thank you.
Great.